The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it became the exact moment the winter air inside the Moonstone Temple turned to solid ice. Seren Vantrell stood in the freezing antechamber of the High Temple, staring straight ahead at the massive iron-wrought doors. Her hands were perfectly still, resting at her sides. She did not fidget with the heavy embroidered sleeves of her bridal gown. She did not pace the frost-covered stone floor. She simply waited, her breathing shallow and controlled, letting the biting cold of the drafty hall at her seep into her bones. The maids had abandoned her nearly 20 minutes ago. They had done their duty, lacing her corset with sharp, unfeeling pulls and arranging the heavy skirts, but their eyes had constantly darted away, refusing to meet her gaze in the mirror. Setrin understood the silent treatment. In the brutal hierarchy of the Lycan courts, a wolfless Omega was a liability. A wolfless Omega about to be crowned queen was an anomaly that the ancient noble houses tolerated only because the Alpha King had willed it, or so she had thought. She lifted a steady hand and touched the edge of the silver veil pinned into her dark hair. The fabric was spun from lunar silk, an heirloom older than the current dynasty, woven by her late mother. It was terrifyingly delicate, slipping through her fingers like liquid moonlight, yet it carried the crushing weight of her entire family's legacy. It was the only armor she had left. A heavy, resounding toll of the temple bell vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up through the soles of her velvet slippers. It was time. The iron-wrought doors groaned open, pulled back by 2 towering royal guards. Immediately, the overwhelming scent of burning mire, crushed winter lilies, and the collective body heat of 300 dominant wolves hit her like a physical blow. The temple was a cavernous beast of black stone and vaulted ceilings, illuminated only by thousands of flickering white candles. Seren stepped over the threshold. The silence that fell over the congregation was not born of awe. It was heavy, lethal, as she began her slow, measured walk down the long center aisle. The whispers started. They were not loud enough to disrupt the sacred quiet, but in a room full of enhanced canine hearing, every murmured insult was a razor dragging across the stone. Look at her, not a drop of true magic in her veins, a disgrace to the throne. How long until the king realizes she cannot carry a proper heir? She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. Let them whisper. Let their hostility claw at the edges of her mind. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She focused entirely on the rhythmic brushing of her heavy skirts against the floor, counting her steps. 1, 2, 3. She forced her lungs to expand, drawing in the frigid air, grounding herself in the physical reality of the moment. At the end of the long aisle, waiting at the raised marble altar, stood Alpha King Ronald Thorne. From a distance, his presence was a suffocating pressure in the room. He was a man carved from absolute authority, with broad, commanding shoulders draped in a ceremonial cloak of deep crimson and gold. His scent, sharp amber and cold iron, rolled down the aisle to meet her, a heavy, dominant aura that usually made the lesser wolves in the room lower their chins in submission. But as Seren drew closer, her heart gave a strange, hollow thud against her ribs. Ronald was not looking at her with the fiery, possessive hunger of an alpha claiming his mate. His jaw was locked, his posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a stance of military defense, not romantic anticipation. His pale, striking eyes passed over her face, over the delicate silver veil, and landed somewhere over her shoulder. The temperature in her blood plummeted. There was no warmth in his gaze. There was only a cold, calculating resolve. She reached the base of the altar. The physical distance between them was mere inches, yet he felt oceans away. He did not extend his hand to help her up the final 3 marble steps, as was the sacred custom. Seren paused, a flicker of confusion tightening her throat, before she lifted her own heavy skirts and ascended the stairs, unassisted. The air around the altar crackled with an unnatural, dry tension. Elder Orion, the high priest of the Moonstone Temple, stood between them. The old wolf was draped in heavy, silver-threaded robes, his blind eyes covered by a ritualistic band, holding the ancient iron-bound text of the moon goddess. A large brass brazier burned between them, sending thick plumes of sweet, intoxicating smoke into the freezing air. "We stand in the shadow of the goddess," Elder Orion's voice boomed, carrying effortlessly to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. To bind what was written in the stars. To merge the strength of the Alpha with the heart of his chosen, sealing the bloodlines for the prosperity of Valdris. Seren stood perfectly still. This was the moment. The culmination of years of quiet endurance, of ignoring the sneers of her own family, of believing that Ronald's quiet promises in the dark gardens had meant more than pack politics. Elder Orion raised his weathered hands over the smoking brazier. "Alpha King Ronald Thorn, do you present yourself to the altar, ready to offer your wrist, your blood, and your spirit to the woman standing before you?" The silence in the temple stretched. It stretched until it became a physical, agonizing wait. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. Seren inhaled, her chest rising beneath the tight corset. She waited for Ronald's deep, rumbling voice to speak the ancient vow. She waited for the scent of amber to wash over her in a wave of protective heat. "I do not." The 2 words left Ronald's lips with the devastating force of an avalanche. The temple plunged into a terrifying absolute silence. Not a single breath was drawn in the vast room. The flame in the brass brazier seemed to flicker and die down, cowering from the sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere. Elder Orion's hands froze in midair. The blind priest turned his head sharply toward the king, his jaw slack with genuine shock. "My king, the rites have begun. The invocation is cast. You cannot." "I am the Alpha King of Valdris," Ronald interrupted, his voice dropping into a lethal low growl that vibrated the stained glass windows high above. "And I will not bind my soul to a fractured vessel." The world tilted. Seren felt the blood drain entirely from her face, rushing to her feet in a sickening swoop. Her lungs constricted, paralyzed by a sudden, freezing numbness. She stared at the man she had loved, the man she had trusted, searching his handsome face for a sign of a curse, of madness, of anything that could explain the nightmare unfolding. Ronald finally looked at her. His eyes were completely devoid of pity. They were sharp, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless. "The throne requires strength," Ronald declared, raising his voice so the entire congregation could hear his condemnation. "It requires magic, vitality, and a bloodline capable of birthing true warriors. I cannot, in good conscience to my people, tether the future of this kingdom to a wolfless, tainted bloodline." The words struck her like physical blows to the stomach. Tainted. He was using the very insecurities she had whispered to him in the dead of night, weaponizing them before the entire nobility. Gasps and hushed, vicious murmurs erupted from the pews behind her. The court was feeding on her humiliation, their previous whispers now validated by the king himself. She didn't know the Alpha King could be this cruel. She didn't know the sacred altar would become a public execution block, and she definitely didn't know that the man who had kissed her forehead 3 nights ago was capable of looking at her with such profound, icy disgust. "This is blasphemy," Elder Orion rasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. "The ceremony is bound by the goddess. To halt it now, to reject a betrothed at the altar, courts the wrath of the ancients. You humiliate this woman before the divine. I protect my kingdom," Ronald snapped, taking a step forward. The sheer force of his dominant aura flared, pushing heavily against the priest, and forcing Seren to lock her knees to keep from stumbling backward. "I will not let an ancient tradition force me to weaken my pack. I reject Seren Vantrell. I reject her blood. I reject her claim to the crown." The finality of the words severed something invisible in the air. A physical drop in temperature swept across the altar, frosting the edges of the brass brazier. Seren's vision blurred at the edges, a ringing sound starting deep within her ears. A normal Omega would have collapsed. A normal woman would have fallen to the marble floor, weeping, begging the king for an explanation, clinging to his crimson cloak, and demanding to know why she was being discarded like broken glass. Seren did none of those things, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, swallowing the massive, jagged lump of pure agony lodged in her throat. When she opened them again, her storm-grey eyes were entirely dry, cold, hollow. She slowly reached up to the delicate silver veil pinned to her hair. Her fingers did not shake. With a terrifyingly calm, deliberate motion, she unpinned the lunar silk. The heavy fabric slid from her shoulders, pooling onto the freezing marble floor between them like spilled mercury. She did not say a word to him. She did not scream. She simply took one step back, out of the sacred circle of the altar, out of the light of the brazier. She lowered her chin in a perfect, flawless, mocking curtsy, holding his gaze the entire time. Ronald's jaw twitched. A flash of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps irritation at her lack of hysterics, crossed his features, but he quickly masked it with royal indifference. He turned his broad back on her, facing the stunned congregation, his voice thundering over the chaos. "The king must have a queen," Ronald announced to the sea of wide eyes. "But it will not be her." He extended his hand toward the front row of the pews. A figure rose from the velvet cushions, stepping smoothly into the aisle. Lillian Vantrell. Seren's lungs stopped working. The freezing numbness in her chest cracked, splintering into a million jagged shards. Her sister was clad in breathtaking ivory silk, adorned with the royal crest of Valdris embroidered in gold thread across her bodice. Lillian's golden hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her smile was radiant, utterly devoid of guilt or hesitation. She did not look at Seren as she ascended the marble steps. She only looked at the king, her eyes alight with the intoxicating thrill of victory. "I choose a true Luna," Ronald declared, pulling Lillian against his chest. His amber scent enveloped the golden-haired Omega. "I choose strength. Lillian Vantrell will wear the crown tonight." The court erupted into a frenzied mix of shock and roaring approval. A strong, magical Omega, a true heir-bearer to them. The cruelty of substituting a mate at the altar was overshadowed by the promise of power. Elder Orion staggered backward, his hands shaking violently as he clutched the iron-bound text. "You cannot force a bond. The goddess has already woven the threads. If you try to claim an unbroken mark, the magic will rebel. Do not do this, my king. I am the law," Ronald roared, his eyes flashing a dominant, unnatural gold. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back at the woman he had just shattered. Ronald grabbed Lillian by the waist, tilting her head to expose the delicate, unmarked curve of her neck, and sank his fangs into her flesh to execute the claiming bite. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. The moment Ronald's teeth pierced Lillian's skin, a deafening, thunderous crack echoed through the Moonstone Temple. It sounded like the very foundations of the earth splitting apart. Lillian did not sigh in the euphoric bliss of a completed bond. She screamed. It was a blood-curdling, guttural shriek of pure agony. Ronald was thrown backward by an invisible explosive force of raw magic, his crimson cloak tearing as he crashed against the brass brazier. Lillian collapsed to her knees, clawing frantically at her throat. Where the king's teeth had touched her, searing, blackened physical burns had erupted. The rejection scars spiderwebbed up her neck and down to her collarbone, hissing and smoking like branded flesh. Ronald clutched his own chest, a matching network of blackened veins crawling up his throat. He gasped for air, his amber eyes wide with sudden, primal terror as the ancient magic violently rejected his choice. Then the true bond revealed itself. A blinding, physical manifestation of the ancient mate bond tore through the freezing air. The golden mating thread. It erupted from Ronald's chest with the force of a dying star, illuminating the cavernous black stone of the temple in a painful, searing light. The thread whipped through the space between them and snapped directly onto Seren's left wrist. The connection hit Seren with the force of a crashing avalanche. A wave of excruciating heat rushed up her arm, battling the freezing ice in her veins. Her wolf, dormant and silent for her entire life, suddenly howled in her mind, a sound of absolute devastation and raw, undeniable power. The thread pulsed, tugging her violently toward the Alpha King, who was currently choking on the floor, drowning in his own hubris. He had rejected her. But his soul, and the ancient cosmic magic, refused to let her go. Ronald looked up. Through the smoke and the blinding light, his eyes locked onto Seren. The absolute certainty in his gaze had shattered. He reached out a trembling, burned hand toward her, the golden thread pulling taut between them. "Seren," he choked out, coughing up a spatter of dark blood onto the white marble. "The bond, it's—" Seren did not move toward him. She did not offer him comfort. The man who had publicly executed her dignity was now begging for her salvation. She looked down at the blinding golden thread wrapped around her wrist. It felt like a chain. A collar meant to drag her back to a kingdom that despised her, to a man who had chosen her sister over her. Not used, not owned, chosen. Her eyes drifted to the altar. Resting on a velvet cushion was the ceremonial silver blade, a sharp, sacred dagger intended for blood oaths. Seren stepped forward. She didn't run to the king. She walked calmly to the altar, picked up the ceremonial silver blade, and wrapped her hand tightly around its hilt. The metal was freezing, a perfect match for her hollow heart. Ronald's eyes widened in sheer horror. "No. Seren, don't." She raised the blade. She kept her head bowed, and her spine straight. And with one vicious, unhesitating strike, Seren sliced the dagger straight through the golden mating thread. The light exploded. A shockwave of pure, untethered magic blasted through the temple, shattering the stained glass windows and blowing out every single candle in the room. Darkness claimed the altar. In the chaotic aftermath, amidst the screaming nobles and the suffocating smoke, Seren dropped the silver blade. She turned her back on her sister's agonizing cries. She turned her back on the choking Alpha King, and she walked out of the heavy iron doors, stepping alone into the blinding, freezing blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but it was nothing compared to the freezing void in her chest, where the ancient magic had been violently severed. The blizzard roared across the Moonstone Temple's marble steps, swallowing the frantic shouts of the court behind her. She didn't look back. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. Seren Van Trell, the discarded bride, walked into the whiteout. For 3 days the storm did not break. The silver veil, woven from lunar silk and meant to be her crowning glory, was the only thing protecting her from the bitter winds. Ice crystals froze to her silver hair, and her boots crunched a solitary rhythm through the deep drifts of the neutral territories. The pain in her wrist, right where she had sliced the golden mating thread, pulsed with a dull, sickening throb. It was a phantom limb, a soul torn in half. The magical backlash burned through her veins, a relentless reminder of the bond she had destroyed. She didn't know how far she had walked. She didn't know where the borders of Valdris ended and the untamed wilds began. And she definitely didn't know that the ancient magic was already weaving a new path from the bloody, frayed ends of her sacrifice. All she knew was the mechanical, agonizing rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other, the freezing snow rapidly numbing her boots and toes, the vast, suffocating silence of the endless forest, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. Silence was the only armor she had left. The temperature plummeted further. The trees grew taller, their dark trunks rising like jagged teeth against the dead white sky. This was no longer the soft, manicured winter of her former pack. This was the ancient primordial north, where monsters roamed and magic ran wild. On the third night, her physical strength finally shattered, her knees buckled. She hit the snowpack hard, the impact jarring her hollow bones. Frost clung to her eyelashes like heavy diamonds. Her breaths came in shallow, rattling gasps, turning to white plumes in the freezing air. The blackness pressed in at the edges of her vision. She curled onto her side, pulling the silver veil tightly around her shivering, bruised frame. The biting cold slowly turned to a deceptive, numbing warmth. It was a quiet way to die, peaceful almost. Then the ground trembled. A low, vibrating rumble resonated through the icy earth beneath her cheek. It wasn't the wind, the scent hit first. Sharp winter pine crushed mint, and the heavy, electric tang of ozone, the smell of a tempest about to break. Through her half-closed eyes, massive shapes materialized from the blizzard, wolves, not the sleek, silver-furred beasts of Valdris, but towering, muscular lycans with pelts as black as midnight and storm-glass grey. They moved with absolute silent lethality. The largest of them stopped inches from her face. His eyes were molten gold. Seren tried to push herself back, but her limbs were entirely unresponsive. The giant wolf lowered its massive head, its hot breath washing over her frozen cheek. There was no aggression in its posture, only a sudden, vibrating shock of absolute stillness. The beast froze, staring at her as if she were a ghost. A deep voice tore through the howling wind. "Shift, Gareth. Secure the perimeter." The wolf beside the golden-eyed giant blurred, bones cracking and reshaping, until a tall, heavily scarred man stood in the snow. Gareth Hale, the Lycan Beta Guard, drew his twin blades, his eyes sweeping the dark tree line. "She's fading, my king, my king!" The golden-eyed wolf shimmered, engulfed in a surge of blinding heat. When the light faded, a man knelt in the snow beside her, Calen Cross, the rival Lycan King of the North, a sovereign whose name was whispered with terrified reverence across the continent. He was a myth forged in blood and ice, a warlord who had never bowed to anyone. But now he was on his knees. Calen reached out, his massive, calloused hands hovering over her trembling form. He didn't just grab her. Even in her half-conscious state, she registered the hesitation, the profound respect. He was waiting for her to pull away. Seren couldn't move. She could only stare into those fierce amber eyes. They weren't looking at her like a broken, discarded thing. They were looking at her like a man seeing water after wandering a desert. "You're freezing," Calen rasped, his voice dropping to a gravelly growl that sent a jolt of raw heat straight to her core. He shrugged off his heavy, fur-lined cloak and wrapped it entirely around her, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed no more than a fallen leaf. The sheer, radiating warmth of his body sank into her aching bones like liquid fire. It was the complete opposite of Ronald Thorne's suffocating, political coldness. This was primal. This was a sanctuary. "Who?" Seren whispered, her voice barely a cracked rasp. Casen's jaw tightened. He pulled her closer to his chest, shielding her face from the biting wind. "Sleep, little moon. No one will ever hurt you again. I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen." The void claimed her, but for the first time in her life, it was warm. 10 days had passed since the broken ritual at the Moonstone Temple. The heavy iron doors of Valdris's throne room remained shut, but they could not keep out the rot. The Pack's magic was withering. Crops in the lower valleys had blackened overnight. The sacred rivers had frozen solid, and the Alpha King was dying. Ronald Thorne gripped the edges of his obsidian throne, his knuckles bone-white. A violent, crushing spasm seized his chest, forcing a wet cough from his lungs. He tasted copper, blood. The bond sickness was tearing him apart from the inside out. It was a relentless, agonizing hollow ache that gnawed at his sanity, a cosmic punishment for defying the sacred laws of true mates. Every breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. "Ronald," a voice whined from the shadows. Lillian Vantrell stepped into the dim light of the hall. She was draped in heavy velvet and jewels, the crown of the queen resting precariously on her head, but she looked like a walking corpse. The left side of her neck, where Ronald had attempted to mark her, was a canvas of ruin. Searing, blackened rejection scars spiderwebbed up her throat, festering with dark magic. Every time she spoke, the jagged lines seemed to pulse with a sickly, bruised purple light. The claiming bite had backfired completely. Magic could not be forced. "The healers say the rot is spreading," Lillian said, her voice shrill with mounting panic. She reached for his arm. Ronald violently ripped his arm away. "Don't touch me!" Lillian flinched, fake tears pooling in her eyes. "I am your chosen mate. We did what was necessary for the Pack." "You lied," Ronald snarled, his voice guttural. He pushed himself off the throne, advancing on her like a cornered predator. His eyes, once a proud, clear blue, were bloodshot and sunken. "You told me Elder Orion confirmed your bloodline. You told me Seren's magic was dead. But when the thread snapped, when the golden mating thread snapped in that temple, it didn't go to you." He grabbed her by the shoulders, his claws digging into the velvet of her dress. Lillian screamed, "It went to her!" Ronald roared, the sound echoing off the cold stone walls. "The magic chose her, and because of your deceit, because I listened to your poisonous whispers, my true mate is gone, and my kingdom is dying," Lillian sobbed, trembling under his grip. "She's dead, Ronald. She walked into the blizzard. No one survives the neutral territories." Ronald shoved her away. Lillian collapsed onto the stone floor, weeping pathetically. He didn't care. He looked down at his own chest, tearing open his tunic to reveal the dark, jagged veins pulsing violently over his heart. His wolf was howling in eternal, maddening grief, clawing at the walls of his mind. Every single beat was a torturous reminder of what he had thrown away. He had watched her leave, like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. Only he had been the arrogant fool who drove her out. He had traded a diamond for a worthless stone, and now he was paying the price. "Garrison!" Ronald bellowed. The heavy doors groaned open, and a terrified guard scrambled into the room, bowing deeply. "Assemble the trackers," Ronald commanded, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of desperation and madness. "Bring Elder Orion. Find her scent. I don't care if it takes every man in the Valdris army. We march north." He watched Lillian sobbing on the floor. Pure disgust coiled in his gut. He had been a fool, but he was still the Alpha King. He would find Seren. He would bring her back, command the bond to heal, and everything would return to normal. He would force the magic to obey him. Far to the north, in the impenetrable fortress of Ashina, the air smelled of roasting meats, pine needles, and sweet cedar. Seren woke to warmth. She blinked against the soft golden light filtering through heavy velvet curtains. She was lying in a massive, fur-covered bed in a room carved from dark, polished stone. A fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the high walls. She wasn't cold anymore. The bone-deep chill that had plagued her for years was entirely gone. She pushed herself up, wincing slightly. Her wrists were bandaged with soft linen, smelling of herbal salves and ancient healing magic. The silver veil, meticulously cleaned and folded, rested on a nearby mahogany chair. The heavy oak door clicked open. Kalen Cross walked in. He was out of his armor, wearing only dark trousers and a loose linen shirt that stretched taut across his heavily muscled chest. The raw power radiating from him was suffocating, yet entirely contained. When his amber eyes locked onto her, the breath hitched in her throat. "You're awake," Kalen said softly. He didn't approach the bed. He stayed near the door, keeping his distance. "Consent, always consent. Where am I?" Seren asked. Her voice was steady, despite the wild, unfamiliar fluttering in her chest. "Ashnir, my territory," Kalen replied. He leaned against the stone archway, his gaze tracing the lines of her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with sudden heat. "Gareth found your scent trail 7 days ago. You walked straight into a death zone, Seren." Seren's breath caught in her throat. 7 days ago. She stared down at her bandaged hands, the weight of the revelation sinking into her fragile bones. She had been unconscious in this wolf's fortress for a full week. 7 entire days of being vulnerable, completely at his mercy, and yet she remained untouched, meticulously healed. She stiffened, her spine going rigidly straight. "You know my name. I know everything that happens in the southern courts," Kalen said, his voice darkening. A dangerous edge crept into his tone, making the shadows in the room seem to lengthen. "I know the Alpha King discarded you for a traitorous sister. I know you severed the sacred thread, and I know the Valdris pack is currently rotting from the inside out because of his arrogance." Seren looked down at her bandaged wrists, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I am wolfless, I am nothing to him, and I am nothing to you, King Kalen." Kalen pushed off the wall. In 3 long strides, he was standing beside the bed. He went down then on one knee on the thick rugs so that his face was lower than hers. He reached out, his massive fingers gently hovering over her bandaged wrist, waiting for her slight nod before he lightly touched the linen. A jolt of pure, crackling electricity shot up her arm. Seren gasped, her eyes flying wide. Kalen's amber eyes flared with sudden molten heat. "Wolfless," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, rumbling purr. "They called you wolfless because they were too blind to recognize a true unbinder." The magic inside you didn't die, Seren. It went dormant to protect you from a pack that didn't deserve it. Seren stared at him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Why did you save me? Kaelin slowly brought her bandaged wrist to his lips, pressing a reverent kiss against the linen. The gesture was so tender, so overwhelmingly protective, that it shattered the last of her icy composure. Because the moment I caught your scent in the blizzard, the beast inside me stopped roaring for war and started demanding a crown for its queen. Kaelin looked up, his gaze fierce and uncompromising. Not used, not owned, chosen. You are safe here, Seren, and if Ronald Thorn ever dares to cross my borders to claim what he threw away, Kaelin's lips pulled back in a feral, terrifying smile. I will mount his head on a pike outside your window. The promise hung in the quiet, fire-warmed air of the nesting room, heavy with lethal sincerity. Seren kept her head bowed, but for the first time in her entire life, she did not instinctively brace for a blow or hide her face in shame. She looked at Kaelin's hands. They were massive, calloused, and scarred from a lifetime of brutal northern wars. Yet they were currently cradling her fragile, bandaged wrist with the absolute reverence of a zealot handling a holy relic. The golden-grey storm of the Lycan King's eyes was entirely focused on her. He wasn't demanding her submission. He was offering his own, disguised as supreme, unapologetic authority. A sudden shiver racked her spine, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing temperatures outside. It was the terrifying, overwhelming realization of what it felt like to be truly seen. Some wounds could only be healed with love, and Kaelin Cross was looking at her like a man seeing water after wandering a barren desert for a century. 200 miles away, the wind howled a completely different song. The blizzard, ripping through the jagged neutral territories, was merciless, turning the world into a blinding void of white, but it paled in comparison to the apocalyptic devastation currently raging inside Ronald Thorn. The Alpha King of Valdris was dying. It was day 10. 10 days since the catastrophe at the Moonstone Temple. 10 days since the moment his arrogance had shattered his own universe. He slumped forward in his ornate, fur-lined saddle, his silver-plated armor, feeling like a literal tomb of ice against his rapidly deteriorating body. The bond sickness was not a poetic metaphor for regret. It was a visceral, biological horror. It had started as a phantom ache behind his ribs the moment Seren fled the temple, but it had rapidly metastasized into a suffocating rot, blackened, diseased veins spiderwebbed beneath the heavy collar of his winter cloak. The rejection scars, the brutal, physical brand of the moon goddess's absolute fury, pulsed with agonizing heat along the side of his neck and chest. Every inhalation tasted of copper and ash. Every beat of his failing heart felt like cracked glass grinding against his sternum. He spurred his exhausted warhorse forward, blind to the biting snow, deaf to the chattering teeth of his elite vanguard, trailing miserably behind him. His inner wolf was completely unhinged. The beast clawed frantically at the internal walls of his mind, howling a singular, blood-curdling note of pure, primal grief. It wanted its mate. It wanted the mate Ronald had thrown away. And because the beast could not reach her, it punished the man. The fever suddenly spiked. A rush of unnatural, blistering heat flooded his brain, blurring his vision until the swirling snow warped into a tunnel of blinding light. His pulse drummed a chaotic, deafening rhythm in his ears, stripping away his balance and drowning out the howl of the wind. His consciousness slipped, untethered and reeling, as the physical world simply fell away. The punishing northern cold vanished entirely. It was abruptly replaced by the heavy, suffocating scent of burning mire and ancient stone. The hallucination dragged him violently backward in time, dropping him right back onto the polished dais of the altar. The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it was the graveyard of his empire. He saw it all play out again in agonizing, slow-motion clarity. The massive stained glass windows of the Moonstone Temple filtering the pale moonlight. Elder Orion standing before the sacred altar, his ancient face pale with shock, holding the ceremonious chalice with trembling hands, and there, standing before the breathless, silent court of Valdris, was Seren. She had worn the silver veil, the delicate heirloom spun from lunar silk, draped beautifully over her silver hair. She had looked ethereal, quiet, patient. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, offering him her unwavering trust. Ronald's blinding ambition had twisted his vision. He hadn't seen a powerful Luna, he had seen a wolfless Omega, a political liability that would weaken his reign in the eyes of the rival Pax. He remembered the exact timbre of his own voice, cold, arrogant, and unbearably loud, echoing off the vaulted ceilings as he halted the sacred ritual. As he publicly discarded the very woman the universe had painstakingly crafted for him, he remembered the chaotic murmurs of the crowd, the way Seren didn't gasp, she didn't cry, she didn't plead or collapse into a hysterical heap. She simply stood there, a terrifying statue of pure ice as he called her sister forward. Lillian. Lillian Vantrell had rushed up the stone steps, her eyes bright with victorious, hollow greed, wearing a gown too lavish and a smile too sharp. She smelled of heavy manufactured rose perfumes, a cloying, suffocating scent explicitly meant to drown out the fact that her soul was completely empty. Ronald closed his eyes, a ragged sob tearing from his frost-bitten lips as the memory forced him to relive the exact moment of the bite. He remembered bending his head. He remembered his inner wolf fighting him with terrifying ferocity, locking his jaw, screaming a warning through his blood that this was a desecration. But the Alpha King had forced the beast to heel. He had pressed his mouth to Lillian's neck. He sank his fangs into her flesh to seal the mark. The instant he tasted Lillian's blood, the world exploded. It was wrong. It was entirely, biologically, fundamentally wrong. The blood tasted like sour poison, a rotting corruption of the highest order. The moon goddess did not accept political substitutes. The rejection was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. A shockwave of dark, cosmic energy erupted from the stone floor beneath their feet. The sacred runes carved deep into the altar flared a blinding, bloody crimson. The magic lashed out like a physical whip of fire. It struck Lillian first, searing the rejection scars deep into her throat. She collapsed to the floor, screaming a horrific, wet sound of agony as the skin on her neck blackened and blistered, the false mating mark rotting the very moment it was forcibly formed. Ronald barely registered her screams. The magic slammed into him next, fracturing his ribs and tearing the breath violently from his lungs. He was thrown backward against the stone pillars, and then the true horror began. Out of the chaotic, swirling energy of the broken ritual, the golden mating thread snapped into existence. It was a blinding, physical manifestation of the ancient mate bond, thick as a ship's rope, glowing with the brilliance of a dying star. It illuminated the entire grand cathedral, exposing the absolute magnitude of Ronald's unforgivable mistake. The thread ignored the weeping, burned sister on the floor entirely. It shot across the dais, vibrating with cosmic urgency, and violently wrapped itself around Seren's wrist. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum, mine. In that singular, fractured fraction of a second, Ronald finally felt it. He felt the terrifying, awe-inspiring power of the true bond. A rush of molten gold flooded his icy veins, the pure, intoxicating scent of winter mint and night-blooming moonflowers washed over him, completely obliterating the stench of Lillian's roses. He felt his soul click into place like a key turning in a lock. The hollow ache he had carried his entire life vanished. He looked up from the floor, gasping for air, his amber eyes locking desperately onto Seren. She was his. She was the other half of his spirit. She was his queen. But the beautiful, fragile Omega, standing at the altar, didn't look back at him with love. She looked at him with an emptiness colder than the grave. While the court screamed in panic and Elder Orion dropped to his knees in pure terror, Seren did not hesitate. She turned calmly toward the altar. She picked up the ceremonial silver blade. She didn't know the Alpha King was suznigly drowning in an ocean of instant, catastrophic regret. She didn't know his beast was mentally clawing at the floor, howling for her mercy. And she definitely didn't know that the ancient unbinder magic dormant in her blood was already stirring to life, recognizing the betrayal. All she knew was that she had been thrown away, and she would not be tethered to a man who did not choose her. She raised the dagger. The sharp, sacred blade caught the crimson light of the burning runes. With one flawless, merciless strike, she brought the heavy silver down, severing the visual manifestation of the bond. The golden mating thread snapped. The backlash of the severed cord hit Ronald like a physical execution. His chest broke wide open. The temple went entirely dark. The hallucination violently shattered. Ronald Thorne jerked forward in his saddle, his eyes snapping open to the brutal, freezing reality of the northern blizzard. He gagged, leaning over the side of his massive horse, as he vomited a thick stream of blackened blood directly into the pristine white snow. He was trembling so violently his armor rattled like loose teeth. 10 days. For 10 agonizing days he had been trapped in this mental loop, watching himself murder his own soul over and over again. He had left Lillian rotting in the Valdris infirmary, driven completely insane by the burning scars, her screams echoing uselessly through the castle corridors. His kingdom was dying. The forests were withering to grey, the magic of the pack, collapsing entirely without its true Luna to anchor it. He wiped his blood-stained mouth with the back of his frozen gauntlet, his amber eyes, bloodshot and hollow, fixed on the towering, jagged peaks of the northern horizon. Somewhere out there, hidden in the sanctuary of Ashenir, was the piece of his soul he had chopped off. He could faintly catch the ghost of her scent on the violent wind. He would find her. He would drag himself through the ice until his knees bled to the bone, and he would take back what was his, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome at the altar, but he would burn the entire realm to the ground before he let another man keep his queen. Hundreds of miles away, wrapped in the heavy fur-lined shadows of the northern lichen sanctuary, Seren Vantrell was trapped in a nightmare of shattered glass and suffocating Mira. The Moonstone Temple. It was always the Moonstone Temple. The memory was a physical weight pressing down on her chest with the suffocating density of the ceremonial incense. In the dream, just as in reality, the marble floor was a block of solid ice beneath her bare knees. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it was the moment the earth opened up and swallowed her alive. She didn't know the Alpha King could see through glamours of loyalty to the rot of his own ambition. She didn't know he had been plotting with her family behind closed doors, and she definitely didn't know how deeply her own sister's betrayal ran until she heard his voice echo through the cavernous holy chamber. Ronald Thorne spoke Lillian's name, not hers. The silence in the grand hall had been absolute, deafening, a suffocating void. Seren remembered the exact feeling of the air leaving her lungs, replaced by a hollow ache that tasted like ash and copper. Lillian stepped forward, her silver gown, a venomous manifestation of her triumph, the fabric whispering against the stone like a serpent. There were no tears from Seren, not a single one fell. Her pride was a fortress of ice, locking her shattered heart away behind a wall of pure, unadulterated dignity. Then Ronald leaned down. His amber eyes, usually so calculating, were clouded with the arrogance of a ruler who believed he could rewrite the laws of the universe. His fangs descended. He sank them into Lillian's neck to seal the stolen claim. The cosmic retribution was instantaneous, and it was violently unforgiving. Lillian's agonizing scream tore through the temple, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that shattered the sacred silence. The magic violently recoiled. Searing, blackened rejection scars spiderwebbed up Lillian's neck, burning the flesh where his teeth had broken the skin, rejecting the false vessel. The identical, agonizing brands erupted across Ronald's chest, burning straight through his regal ceremonial robes as the ancient magic punished the heresy of his substitution. Then, the true bond revealed itself. A blinding physical manifestation of the ancient mate bond snapped into the room, illuminating the horrified faces of the nobility. The golden mating thread, It erupted from the center of Ronald's bleeding chest, a burning, violent cord of molten light. It bypassed the weeping, convulsing Lillian entirely and whipped through the air, snapping directly onto Seren's delicate wrist. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum, shaking the very foundations of the temple. Mine. It burned. The golden string was a collar of fire, trying to force her into submission, trying to tether her soul back to a man who had just discarded her like worthless trash before the entire court. The pain was meant to bring an Omega to her knees. It was meant to force compliance, but the pain did something else. It cracked the ancient, forgotten seals on her bloodline. Deep within her veins, a dormant, terrifying force stirred from its centuries-long slumber, the Unbinder magic. It rushed through her biological system, a river of liquid silver, freezing the searing heat of the mystical tether, fortifying her bones with a power that bowed to no king. Seren rose to her feet. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She simply reached out, her movements fluid and devoid of hesitation, and took the ceremonial silver blade from the altar. Elder Orion, the high priest, gasped in horror, his frail hands trembling as he fell back from the dais. The elder tried to pray, babbling ancient warnings into the chaos, but Seren ignored him. He was a servant to the goddess. She was currently embodying her wrath. She channeled the ancient force down her arm and into the dagger. The sharp, sacred steel hummed, vibrating violently as it glowed with a chilling storm-glass grey light. Ronald saw what she held. Through the agony of his burning chest, the arrogance finally melted from his features, replaced by a primal, suffocating terror. He recognized the magic. He realized, in that split second, the magnitude of the queen he had just thrown away. He reached for her, his bloodied hand outstretched, his mouth opening in a desperate, silent plea to stop. Too late. Seren brought the humming blade down. She sliced through the visual manifestation of the bond, like a blade through silk. The snap was explosive. A shockwave of pure magical recoil blasted through the temple. The massive stained glass windows shattered outward in a deafening crescendo, raining colored shards onto the snow below. Ronald collapsed to the cold marble, screaming as the severing tore a jagged, bleeding hole straight through his soul. Seren remained perfectly still amidst the destruction. She reached up, her fingers remarkably steady, and unpinned the heirloom woven from lunar silk from her hair. She dropped the silver veil onto the blood-stained floor. Let Lillian have the ruins. Let them choke on the ashes of their betrayal. She turned her back on the broken king. She ignored the terrified, whimpering nobles pressing themselves against the walls. She walked down the aisle, her boots crunching rhythmically over shattered glass, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The blizzard howled, a wall of blinding white. She stepped into the freezing void, letting the ice claim her. Seren. The deep, gravelly voice pulled her back from the freezing edge of the memory. Seren gasped, her eyes flying open. She surged upright, her hands clawing at the heavy furs tangling around her legs. Her chest heaved, pulling in desperate breaths of air. Her wrist throbbed with a phantom-burning sensation, and she instinctively gripped it, her fingernails digging into her own flesh, half expecting to see the golden cord still wrapped around her skin, dragging her back south. Instead, she saw the warm, roaring hearth of her chambers in Ashenir. The heavy black stone walls were an impenetrable fortress. The air was thick with the grounding scent of pine, ozone, and impending rain, a scent that instantly lowered her skyrocketing heart rate. You are safe. Kalen Cross was sitting on the edge of the massive mattress. The rival Lycan King didn't crowd her. He didn't reach out to grab her or restrain her thrashing limbs like Ronald would have. He simply anchored her with his overwhelming presence, his storm-grey eyes fixed entirely on her face. His aura was a blanket of protective heat, pushing back the lingering venomous chill of the nightmare. Outside the heavy oak door, a shadow shifted. Gareth Hale stood guard. The Lycan Beta Guard was a silent sentinel in the corridor, his loyalty to his king and his king's chosen undeniable. Knowing the guard was there, forming a physical barrier between her and the outside world, helped ease the trembling in her shoulders. Seren swallowed hard, trying to soothe her raw throat. A cold sweat clung to her skin, making her shiver despite the roaring fire. "I felt him," she rasped, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The sickness, his pain, it echoed through the severed end of the bond. "He is deteriorating, Kaelin, and he is coming. I can feel the desperation pulling him toward the northern borders." Kaelin's jaw tightened until the muscle ticked. A low, dangerous rumble vibrated deep in his massive chest, a sound that promised absolute, catastrophic violence to anyone who dared cross his borders to threaten what was his. "Let him come," Kaelin said softly, though the words carried the devastating weight of an executioner's axe. He finally lifted his hand, moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness to ensure she saw it coming and had the space to pull away. When she remained perfectly still, accepting his proximity, his large, calloused fingers gently brushed a damp strand of silver hair from her forehead. The contrast in temperature was staggering. Where Ronald had been a suffocating, demanding curse, Kaelin was a roaring fire in the dead of winter, a sanctuary made of muscle, fang, and ancient honor. "He thinks he can track a bond he shattered with his own teeth," Kaelin murmured, his thumb lightly grazing her jawline, his touch mapping the delicate bones of her face, as if she were the most precious artifact in the realm. "He thinks his crumbling crown gives him the right to reclaim what he arrogantly threw away. But he will find nothing but ash and steel if he steps foot in my territory. He will not touch you, Seren, not while I draw breath." Seren closed her eyes, leaning slightly into his warm palm. The phantom pain on her wrist finally began to recede, chased away by the steady, grounding rhythm of Kaelin's heartbeat from where he sat. She had stepped out of the Moonstone Temple, expecting to freeze to death in the neutral territories. She had expected the ancient power to drain the last of her mortal life force in the snow. Instead, she had found a true sanctuary. She had found a sovereign who looked at her not as a political pawn to be traded, but as an equal, as a queen who needed no crown to command respect. "I won't go back," she whispered into the quiet, fire-lit room, stating it not as a fear, but as an unbreakable vow. "I would burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen," Kaelin replied. His vow wasn't an empty threat, it was a blood oath. He watched her like a man, seeing water after wandering a desert, his devotion a heavy, intoxicating weight. She wasn't a prisoner here. She wasn't a discarded Omega begging for scraps of affection. Not used, not owned. Chosen. Some wounds could only be healed with love, but others required the absolute, unyielding protection of a monster who bowed only to her. Seren took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of pine filling her lungs, and finally let the memory of the altar fade back into the dark. 10 days, 10 excruciating, blood-stained days since the Moonstone Temple shattered into 1,000,000 irreversible pieces. The blizzard howling through the neutral territories felt less like winter weather, and more like a deliberate, cosmic punishment. Ronald dragged his heavy boots through the knee-deep snow. The biting wind tore at his thick fur cloak, but the true agony was not the freezing temperature. It was the sickening, boiling heat radiating from the dead center of his chest, the bond sickness. With every labored, rattling breath, the blackened, spiderwebbing rejection scars on his flesh throbbed. They pulsed with an unholy rhythm. He tasted copper. He tasted bile. The vanguard of his royal guard marched silently behind him, their heads bowed, their eyes wide with poorly concealed terror. They could smell it, the decaying scent of their once invincible Alpha King, the slow, agonizing death of their pack's magic. Without a true Luna, the land itself was rejecting them. The rivers were freezing solid, the protective wards were crumbling. He stumbled. His armored knees hit the frozen earth with a dull, heavy thud. The whiteout around him blurred, replaced for a sickening, visceral second by the polished marble of the temple. The hallucination hit him with the force of a physical blow. He saw her again. Seren. Standing at the altar, draped in the gossamer perfection of the silver veil. He heard the exact devastating silence that fell when he spoke Lillian's name instead of hers. He saw the golden mating thread snap violently into existence, wild and blinding, a cosmic rebellion against his spoken vow. He saw Seren raise the ceremonial silver blade. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't begged for his love. She had simply severed the magic with a single, brutal slash. Then she walked away. Ronald gasped, his clawed gauntlets tearing at his chest plate as the hallucination faded back into the howling ice. He watched her leave like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. At the time, his blinding arrogance had shielded him. He had truly believed an Alpha King could assert his political will over the ancient god's design. Now he was a starving beast dying of thirst in a frozen wasteland. Through the blinding sheets of snow, a dark, jagged shape loomed. A ruined structure half buried in the drift, a forgotten, ancient lunar shrine. Driven by a desperate, magnetic pull, Ronald dragged himself toward the crumbling stone steps. The ambient magic in the air tasted of ozone and ancient grief. He reached out with a trembling hand, pressing his palm against the frost-covered surface of the ruined altar. The reaction was instantaneous, catastrophic. A guttural roar ripped from his throat, echoing over the screaming wind. The stone did not offer comfort. It reflected the absolute magnitude of his heresy. The rejection scars flared with a sudden, searing golden light, burning as if invisible fire was being poured directly into his veins. He collapsed entirely onto the broken floor, his massive body convulsing. Black, corrupted blood dripped from his lips, staining the pristine snow beneath his chin. "My king!" One of the vanguard lunged forward, but an invisible shockwave of volatile, fractured alpha aura blasted the guard backward into a snowbank. Ronald couldn't breathe. His lungs seized, rigid as iron. The feverish bond sickness reached its horrifying peak, suffocating him from the inside out. He had rejected the true mate. He had tried to cheat destiny. Now the ancient magic was eating him alive. He curled into himself on the freezing stone, weeping dark tears of pure physical agony. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. He had made his choice, and now, as he choked on his own decay, a single, desperate thought thundered through his fracturing mind. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone." Hundreds of miles south, there was no freezing wind, only an oppressive, sickening heat that choked the stagnant air of the capital's healing chambers. Lillian screamed. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a raw, animalistic shriek of pure, unadulterated torment that echoed off the high stone ceilings, driving the junior healers back against the walls in sheer horror. She writhed on the ruined silk sheets of her sickbed, her once flawless skin slick with fever sweat. "Hold her down," Elder Orion commanded, his voice trembling despite his decades of stoic service. 4 strong guards pinned, Lillian's thrashing limbs to the heavy oak mattress. But brute strength could not stop the spread of divine corruption. The rejection scars that marred her throat, the exact, horrific spot where Ronald had attempted the claiming bite, were bubbling. The blackened, necrotic veins pulsed with an unholy heat, spreading like spilled ink beneath her collarbone. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of a stolen crown. The cosmic magic did not just deny her. It was actively, violently punishing her complicity in the betrayal. "Please," Lillian shrieked, her voice cracking into a pathetic rasp. "Make it stop. I am the queen. I am his chosen." Lie. Orion stepped forward, a heavy silver bowl clutched in his trembling hands. The sharp smell of burning sage and sterilized water filled the sweltering room, fighting a losing battle against the metallic stench of rotting magic. He dipped a pristine linen cloth into the holy water and pressed it firmly to Lillian's blistering neck. The moment the blessed water touched the dark magic, it hissed violently. Plumes of acrid black smoke erupted from her skin. Lillian arched her spine so hard her bones popped, a horrifying wet gurgle escaping her lips. The holy remedies did not soothe the wound. They recognized the mark as an abomination and attacked it. Orion stumbled backward, dropping the silver bowl. It clattered loudly against the stone floor, spilling water that sizzled and evaporated upon touching the corrupted flesh that had flaked from her throat. He stared at the bubbling tissue that was permanently disfiguring her prized beauty. The curse was irreversible. The divine judgment was absolute. Lillian's frantic, arrogant demands devolved into pathetic, wet sobs. Her vanity, her singular defining weapon, was being stripped away layer by agonizing layer. The gilded mirror across the room had already been shattered, but she didn't need a reflection to know she was completely ruined. The dark scar was solidifying, transforming her into a living, breathing monument of her own treason. Orion's face turned a pallid, storm-glass grey. He raised a shaking hand, signaling the terrified guards to release her. "Elder Orion," one of the healers whispered wide-eyed, "we must try the lunar moss. We must—" "No," Orion rasped, the crushing weight of the divine wrath heavy on his ancient shoulders. "There is nothing more to be done. We cannot heal what the ancient gods have cursed." He turned his back on her screams. The profound, heavy silence of the divine verdict in his heart was far louder than her physical agony. The cold reality of the northern borders offered no such heat, yet Ronald burned just the same. He lay in the snow-choked ruins, his massive fingers digging into the frost. The golden mating thread, the blinding light of the true bond, it still haunted the periphery of his fading vision. Every beat of his failing heart pumped a hollow, echoing ache through his chest. His vanguard watched in stunned, terrified silence as their invincible king dragged himself upward. His breathing was a wet, pathetic wheeze. His immaculate royal armor was caked in ice and his own dark blood. The majestic aura that usually demanded instant, unquestioning submission from an entire continent was shattered, leaking out of him in jagged, broken shards. He forced his heavy head up. He looked toward the jagged horizon, toward the northern sanctuary of Ashenir, toward the territory of Kalen. The thought of the rival king standing near Seren sent a violent, territorial jolt of adrenaline through his decaying nervous system. It was the only thing keeping his heart beating, the primal, desperate instinct of a mate, denied. Ronald didn't know the depth of the unbinder magic that slept in her veins. He didn't know that Kalen had already sworn a blood oath to protect her, establishing her not as property, but as an equal. And he definitely didn't know that the very bond he was so desperate to reclaim was already shifting, finding a new, truer resonance in the protective shadow of his greatest rival. All he knew was the agonizing, freezing void in his soul. "Get up," Ronald snarled to his frozen men, though the command ended in a bloody, choking cough. He forced himself completely to his feet, swaying heavily against the gale. The wind howled, mocking his broken pride. "We march on Ashenir. If they do not return her..." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't have the breath. But the chilling truth hung in the freezing air between them. He would tear the world apart to undo his mistake, even if the ancient magic killed him in the process. He would break the sanctuary. He would slaughter the rival king. Because a king who had lost his crown could learn to live in exile. But a wolf who had severed his own soul had nothing left to lose. He took another agonizing step into the blizzard. The rejection scars screamed across his chest, a constant, searing reminder of the name she hadn't spoken, and the terrifying silence that was currently destroying his kingdom. He had rejected her at the altar, and now the universe was demanding payment in blood. Miles away, the echo of his agony slammed into Seren's consciousness, a brutal psychic shockwave that dragged her back into the dark. The nightmare did not begin with the warmth of the Ashenir sanctuary. It began in the ice. She was back in the blinding whiteout of the neutral territories, the relentless northern blizzard clawing at her fragile human form. The silver veil, once meant to symbolize purity and grace for a bride, was now a frozen shroud, dragging her down into the endless drifts. Every breath she dragged into her lungs felt like swallowing shattered glass. The cold wasn't just a temperature. It was a physical predator, biting into her exposed skin, turning her blood to sluggish slush. The memory of the Moonstone Temple played on a sickening, endless loop in her mind. Ronald's voice, cold and final, discarding her in front of the entire court, echoing off the ancient stone pillars. Lillian's smug face, flushed with triumph, suddenly turning into a twisted mask of pure terror as the rejection scars ignited across her neck. The sickening smell of burning flesh mingling with the sweet incense of the altar. The blinding, physical manifestation of the golden mating, thread snapping violently into the room, a cosmic demand that Ronald had arrogantly tried to overrule. She remembered the heavy, ornate weight of the ceremonial silver blade in her hand. The sickening metallic sound of the ancient magic being severed by her own volition, a desperate act of survival to prevent the volatile magic from consuming her alive. Tainted bloodline, weak, unworthy. The whispers of the Valdris court hissed through the howling wind, wrapping around her throat like a physical chain, choking the life out of her. In the dream, she ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her vision blurred at the edges. Her legs were heavy, numb stumps, sinking deeper into the snow with every agonizing step. The phantom pain of the severed bond throbbed relentlessly in her left wrist, a bleeding, hollow ache that refused to heal. It was a sick, twisted feedback loop. Ronald was deteriorating, the ancient magic eating him alive for his hubris, and because he had forced the initial severing, his suffering bled backward through the void where their connection used to be. Seren. The voice in the wind wasn't a hallucinated whisper. It was a command, laced with an Alpha King's desperate, dying pride. The word thundered through the broken bond, or what was left of the ruined conduit, like a war drum. Mine. She didn't know the Alpha King could be so utterly broken by the very laws he had arrogantly tried to rewrite. She didn't know the ancient gods demanded such a brutal, physical toll for substituting a chosen mate for a fated one. And she definitely didn't know, that his decaying resonance would still have the power to pull her beneath the ice, dragging her down into his own personal hell. All she knew was the crushing weight of the snow. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, even as her knees finally gave out. She collapsed into the frozen white void, the darkness rushing up to claim her as the last remnants of her magic flickered and died. Then a violent jolt. Seren woke with a sharp, ragged gasp. Her eyes snapped open, her body thrashing instinctively against a heavy weight that pinned her down. Breathe. The command was low, rough, and vibrating with an authority that instantly silenced the screaming panic in her mind. She wasn't in the snow. The freezing numbness vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, almost suffocating wave of heat. She was buried beneath thick, heavy wolf pelts, lying in the center of a massive, intricately carved bed. The nesting room. The air was thick with the rich scent of cedar, burning pine, and the sharp, crackling tang of ozone. She dragged a trembling hand across her forehead, her skin slick with cold sweat. Her chest heave as she desperately tried to reorient herself. The dark stone walls of the Ashenir sanctuary glowed with the warm, golden light of a roaring hearth fire. The crackle of the logs was the only sound in the vast, imposing chamber, and sitting beside the bed, a massive silhouette against the firelight, was Cailan Cross. The Northern Lycan King did not loom over her. He sat perfectly still in a high-backed wooden chair, his long legs stretched out, his massive hands resting lightly on the armrests. Yet his sheer physical presence was a suffocating weight in the room. He was a creature of primal violence, a sovereign whose name made entire empires tremble, and yet here he sat, keeping a quiet, unbroken vigil over a runaway Omega who had arrived at his borders half dead. His storm-grey eyes were locked onto her face, tracking the frantic pulse jumping at the base of her throat. The jagged scars that crossed his strong jaw and disappeared beneath the collar of his dark tunic shifted slightly as his expression hardened. He was terrifying. He was absolute power barely contained in human flesh, and yet the aura rolling off him was completely devoid of aggression. It was a shield, a roaring, protective wall of heat designed to push back the lingering frost of her nightmare and shelter her from the outside world. "He's dying," Seren rasped, her voice a broken whisper. The words tasted like ash on her tongue. Cailan didn't move. He didn't ask for clarification. He just waited, his stillness demanding the truth she was too terrified to speak aloud. "Ronald," she continued, her fingers curling convulsively into the dark fur of the pelts, seeking an anchor. "He's coming, the bond. He broke it at the altar, but the void it left is killing him. He's marching his vanguard on Ashenir." I felt his pulse fail. I felt the exact moment his magic began to eat itself. At the mention of the rival Alpha King's name, the temperature in the room spiked. It wasn't the comforting warmth of the hearth. It was the blistering, lethal heat of a lichen preparing for war. Kaelin's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking rhythmically under his scarred skin. "Let him come," Kaelin said. His voice was lower, quieter than it had been in the great hall. It lacked the theatrical boom of a monarch addressing a court, but it carried a deadly, absolute certainty that sent a shiver down her spine. Let him freeze in the northern valleys. Let him shatter his desperate army against my iron gates. He will not set a single foot inside this sanctuary. Seren stared at him, her chest aching with a hollow tightness. "You don't understand, Kaelin. He won't stop." He realizes now that the moon goddess's laws cannot be rewritten by a political decree. He rejected me for Lillian, and the magic violently backfired. His kingdom is dying without its true Luna. He thinks he can just take me back, reclaim me by force to save himself and his throne. Kaelin finally moved. The sheer speed of an ancient lichen was always jarring, a sudden blurring of motion that defied human comprehension. 1 second he was seated in the chair, and the next he was kneeling directly beside the bed. He went down on one knee on the cold stone floor, deliberately lowering his face so that he was looking up at her. It was a gesture of profound, shocking submission from a sovereign who bowed to no one. He discarded what he could not understand. Kaelin growled softly, reaching out. He didn't grab her. He hovered his massive, calloused hand an inch above her trembling fingers, waiting for her silent consent. Slowly, carefully, Seren uncurled her fingers and let her hand rest against his broad palm. The contact was electric. A searing, comforting jolt of energy shot up her arm, completely eradicating the lingering phantom pain in her wrist, replacing the freezing agony with molten gold. He rejected a Luna because he wanted a compliant pawn, Kaelin said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. The touch was reverent, mapping the delicate bones of her hand like she was the most precious artifact in his realm. He did not know what lived in your blood, Seren. He did not see the unbinder magic sleeping beneath the surface. He only saw a quiet omega he thought he could break and replace. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. That had always been her armor against a cruel world. But looking down into Kaelin's fierce storm-grey eyes, she felt a dangerous, terrifying urge to let the heavy armor finally crack open. "And what do you see, my king?" she whispered into the quiet room, the formal title slipping out before she could stop it. Kaelin's eyes flared, a brilliant ring of molten gold, momentarily bleeding into the stormy grey. "I see the true Queen of the North," he breathed, his voice dropping to a harsh, possessive rumble that vibrated deep in her chest. "I see a woman who walked out of the Moonstone Temple with nothing but her dignity, and brought the greatest kingdom in the south to its knees without lifting a single blade." He leaned in closer, his forehead resting lightly against the back of her hand. The radiating heat of his skin was an anchor, pulling her completely out of the suffocating nightmare and grounding her in the physical reality of his devotion. "I swear it on my blood, Seren Vantrell. I swear it on the ancient gods and the sacred graves of my ancestors. Ronald Thorn will never touch you again. If he breaches the borders of Ashenir, I will tear the cursed crown from his head with my bare hands. I will burn Valdris to the ground before I allow that male to speak your name or claim what he threw away. Not used, not owned, chosen." The phrase echoed in the quiet space between them like a sacred vow. For the first time since the rejection scars had burned Lillian's skin, since the golden mating thread had snapped in the temple, Seren felt the dormant, ancient magic inside her begin to fully uncoil. The unbinder magic, long suppressed by fear and rejection, reacted to Kaelin's absolute vow. It didn't spark with violent retaliation. It hummed with a deep, radiant warmth, a golden resonance that flowed from her fingertips into Kaelin's, intertwining seamlessly with his monstrous, protective strength. She hadn't just survived the freezing blizzard to die in exile. She had been led here, to him. "He will demand a parley," Seren said, her voice finally steadying. The pathetic trembling had stopped. The phantom ache in her chest was entirely gone, replaced by the steady, thumping, war drum rhythm of the Lycan King's heartbeat against her palm. He will invoke the ancient rites to demand the return of his mate. Kaelin lifted his head, a dark, lethal smile playing on his lips, revealing the edge of his elongated canines. Let him invoke the rites. Let him stand before the heavy gates of Ashenir and demand what is no longer his. He stood up, towering over the bed once more, but the terrifying aura was gone, replaced entirely by an unyielding, unbreakable shield of absolute devotion, because the mate bond cannot be forced, and it certainly cannot be stolen. Kaelin's eyes locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that took her breath away, leaving her breathless and safe. Rest, Seren. When the time comes, you will not face him as a discarded Omega trembling in the snow. You will face him as my equal, as my chosen. Seren leaned back against the thick pelts, the comforting scent of cedar and ozone wrapping around her like a physical embrace. Outside the thick stone walls of the fortress, the winter wind howled, a desperate, freezing scream that carried the dying pride of a foolish king miles away. But inside the sanctuary, there was only warmth, the crackle of the hearth, and the quiet, terrifying promise of a rival king who was willing to slaughter the entire world to keep her safe. She closed her eyes, the lingering echoes of the nightmare finally silenced for good. She had stepped aside once at the altar, believing herself unworthy of a fight. She would never step aside again. The morning sun broke through the heavy overcast sky, casting long, pale shafts of light across the dark stone floor of the nesting room. Seren Vantrell stood by the massive arched window, her fingertips resting lightly against the frost ferns blooming on the thick glass. For the first time since she had walked out of the Moonstone Temple, she was entirely alone with her own thoughts, and the silence did not feel like a weapon. In Valdris, silence had always been a punishment. It was the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that followed Ronald's dismissive glares, or the mocking quiet of the court when Lillian paraded her stolen privileges. But here, deep within the impenetrable fortress of Ashenir, the quiet was a thick, protective blanket. She took a slow, deep breath. The sharp pain in her chest, the phantom echo of the severed golden mating thread, had receded to a dull, manageable ache. Her body, pushed to the absolute brink of starvation and frostbite during her flight through the neutral territories, was finally beginning to knit itself back together. She wasn't wearing her mother's torn, frozen lace anymore. Instead, she was draped in a soft, oversized tunic of spun dark wool, incredibly warm and smelling faintly of cedar and snow. A soft, deliberate knock at the heavy oak door broke the stillness. It wasn't a demand for entry. It was a polite request. "You may enter," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, no longer the raspy croak of a dying Omega. The heavy iron hinges swung open with barely a whisper, and Kaelin Cross stepped into the room. The Northern Lycan King ducked his head slightly to clear the massive doorframe. He was out of his battle armor, wearing simple dark trousers and a loose linen shirt that stretched taut across his broad shoulders, leaving the jagged scars on his forearms fully exposed. In his massive, battle-hardened hands, he carried a steaming wooden tray. Seren immediately tensed, an involuntary biological reflex conditioned by years of walking on eggshells around unpredictable alphas. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, waiting for the inevitable command or the heavy weight of expectations. But Kaelin did not approach her. He stopped a full 10 paces away, setting the tray down on a small, sturdy oak table near the roaring hearth. He kept his movements deliberately slow, broadcasting his intentions so she wouldn't be startled. "Breakfast," the Sovereign murmured, his deep voice a soothing rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "Bone broth, marrow, and winter mint root. My healers insisted you consume it while it is boiling hot. It will help rebuild the blood you lost in the blizzard." He didn't cross the invisible boundary line he had drawn between them. He simply stood by the fire, clasping his hands behind his back, giving her complete spatial dominance over the room. It was a masterclass in primal restraint. A king who commanded thousands of lethal warriors was consciously shrinking his own overwhelming aura to ensure she felt absolutely safe. "You don't have to serve me, Kaelin," she said softly, turning away from the frost-covered glass to face him. "I am not serving you out of obligation, Seren." His storm-grey eyes locked onto hers, steady and entirely devoid of pity. "I am offering care because you require it, and because, in this sanctuary, you will never have to beg for the basic necessities of life. You eat when you are hungry. You sleep when you are tired. You speak when you have something to say. There are no hidden tests here." She walked slowly toward the table. The rich, savory aroma of the broth hit her senses, making her stomach clench with sudden, ravenous hunger. She sat down in the high-backed chair, wrapping her trembling hands around the warm clay bowl. The heat seeped into her palms, a stark contrast to the freezing nightmare she had barely survived. As she took the first sip, the nutrient-dense liquid coated her throat, sending a rush of vital warmth straight to her core. She closed her eyes, savoring the simple, profound luxury of being nourished. Kaelin remained standing by the hearth, the firelight catching the molten gold flecks in his eyes. He watched her with a quiet, intense focus, tracking the color returning to her pale cheeks. "He will reach the outer gates by nightfall," Kaelin stated suddenly. The abrupt shift in topic didn't come with a spike in aggression. It was delivered as a simple tactical fact. "My scouts have tracked his vanguard. They are moving at a desperate pace, leaving their dead behind in the snowdrifts." Seren's hands tightened around the bowl. The mention of the Southern King sent a brief, involuntary shudder down her spine. She whispered, "The bond sickness is ravaging him," the Lycan King continued, his tone entirely clinical, devoid of sympathy. "When an alpha attempts to force a claiming bite on a false mate, the moon goddess does not merely reject the vow, she actively poisons the magic of the aggressor. He is rotting from the inside out. He believes that if he drags you back to Valdris and forces the ceremony a second time, the sickness will lift." Set the bowl down. The broth suddenly tasted heavy. She looked down at her left wrist, where the ethereal thread of light had once connected her to a man who had publicly discarded her. The skin was smooth, unblemished, but the memory of the ceremonial silver blade cutting the connection was etched into her soul. "And if he demands I be handed over?" she asked, her voice tight. "If he invokes the ancient treaties to avoid an all-out war?" Kaelin let out a low, dark chuckle that sounded more like the rumble of a waking avalanche. He finally stepped closer, though he still maintained a respectful distance, stopping just on the other side of the small table. The ancient treaties were written to protect fated mates, Seren, not to reward arrogant fools who throw their blessings into the dirt. He leaned his massive hands on the edge of the wood, bringing his face closer to her level. "Let me be perfectly clear. I do not care about political treaties. I do not care about the stability of the Valdris throne. I only care about the woman sitting in this room." He reached across the table, his fingers lightly brushing against the edge of her wooden bowl, not quite touching her hand, but offering the physical anchor of his presence. "When he arrives, he will face my iron gates. He will bleed, and he will scream his demands into the winter wind. But you will not be forced to look at him unless you explicitly desire it." Kaelin's eyes darkened with a ferocious, unyielding promise. "You are the one who holds the power now, my lady. You have the Unbinder magic sleeping in your veins. You have the full military might of the Northern Pack standing between you and that pathetic excuse for an alpha. You decide his fate." She looked at the massive Lycan, the man who had pulled her from the ice, and asked for nothing in return except her survival. The instinct to hide, to make herself small and invisible, was finally dissolving, replaced by a quiet, rising strength. The true dignity in the face of betrayal wasn't just about walking away. It was about realizing she never deserved to be treated like an option in the first place. "I don't want him dead, Kaelin," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I want him to realize exactly what he lost. I want him to live with the terrifying knowledge that he destroyed his own kingdom. A terrifying, beautiful smile spread across Kaelin's scarred face. It was the smile of a predator who had just been given permission to play with his food. Then we shall let him rot at the gates, Seren. We shall let him choke on his own regret. Miles away, at the very edge of the Northern Territory, the blizzard was a blinding, screaming entity of white rage. The jagged, black iron spikes of the Ashenir border gates loomed out of the storm like the teeth of a giant beast, impenetrable and completely unyielding. Ronald Thorne collapsed into the knee-deep snow. The Alpha King of Valdris, once a picture of golden arrogance and absolute political authority, looked like a walking corpse. His luxurious fur cloak was in tatters, heavy with frozen slush and dried black blood. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones, tinged with the greyish-blue hue of severe frostbite. Every time he dragged a breath of freezing air into his lungs, a wet, rattling cough tore its way up his throat, spraying dark crimson droplets onto the pristine snow. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the agony burning across his chest. The rejection scars, the horrific, necrotic burns he had received the moment his fangs had touched Lillian's neck at the altar, were actively spreading, the black, jagged lines spiderwebbed across his pectorals and up his collarbone, pulsating with a sickening, toxic heat. It was the bond sickness. His own magic, denied its true conduit, was cannibalizing his internal organs. "My king!" a desperate voice shouted over the howling wind. A Valdris guard, one of the few who hadn't frozen to death or abandoned the suicide march, grabbed his arm, trying to haul him upright. "We cannot stay here. The cold is dropping. We must set up a perimeter." Ronald violently shoved the guard away, his golden eyes blown wide with a feverish, manic desperation. "No," he snarled, the sound mutating into a wet wheeze. "She is here. I can smell her." He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, ignoring the agonizing burn of the snow against his bare skin where his gloves had torn. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring as he sifted through the scent of ozone and pine, and there it was. Beneath the harsh metallic smell of the iron gates, buried under the heavy scent of northern lichen guards, was the unmistakable, delicate fragrance of moonflowers and winter mint. Seren. The scent hit him like a physical blow to the gut. For 10 excruciating days he had lived with the suffocating void of her absence. He had hallucinated her quiet curtsy at the altar. He had replayed the exact, sickening sound of the ceremonial silver blade, severing their connection thousands of times in his nightmares. He had left her treacherous sister behind in the infirmary, screaming as her own scars rotted her beauty away. He had thrown away a true fated Luna for a political pawn, and the consequence was the slow, agonizing death of his entire pack. Ronald dragged himself upright, his legs shaking violently. He stumbled toward the massive iron gates, his hands reaching out to grip the frozen metal bars. The cold burned his palms, but he didn't care. "Seren," he roared, the sound tearing his vocal cords. "Seren, show yourself!" From the shadows of the towering stone battlements above, a lone figure stepped into the swirling snow. It wasn't the quiet Omega he had discarded. It was Gareth Hale. The Lycan Beta Guard stood at the edge of the parapet, staring down at the dying Southern King with an expression of profound boredom. Gareth was wrapped in thick, dark furs, his massive arms crossed over his broad chest. He didn't look cold. He looked like a mountain that had been slightly inconvenienced by a passing breeze. "You are trespassing on sovereign northern territory, Ronald Thorne," Gareth called out, his voice carrying effortlessly over the storm. It wasn't a shout. It was a heavy, commanding boom that demanded obedience. "Turn your men around and march back to the south. You have no business here." Ronald gripped the iron bars tighter, his knuckles turning white. The necrotic pain in his chest flared, forcing a choked gasp from his lips. "She is inside," he gritted out, his golden eyes flashing with a desperate feral light. "My mate is inside your walls. I invoke the right of retrieval. Open these gates, or I will consider this an act of war." Gareth didn't flinch. He didn't even shift his stance. He simply looked down at Ronald as if he were observing a particularly pathetic insect struggling in a puddle. "You have no mate," the Beta replied coldly. The words fell like heavy stones, crushing whatever fragile hope Ronald had managed to carry through the blizzard. You broke the ritual at the Moonstone Temple. You chose a false bride, and the moon goddess burned you for your insolence. The woman you are looking for owes you nothing. She is mine, and my pack is dying, Ronald screamed, a hysterical edge creeping into his voice. His royal composure completely shattered by the weight of his political and personal failure. He slammed his fist against the iron gate. The metal didn't even vibrate. The magic in Valdris is rotting away without its true Luna. The golden mating thread claimed her. The magic chose her. I am her alpha, and she belongs by my side. If I do not bring her back, my entire kingdom will fall. Gareth let out a short, dismissive scoff. The magic chose her, yes. But she severed the thread with a silver blade because you were unworthy to hold it. You threw her away in front of your entire court. You condemned your own people the moment you let pride overwrite fate. Did you truly believe you could just walk into the north and demand her back like a misplaced cloak to fix your own monumental blunder? Ronald's knees buckled. He sagged against the gate, the freezing iron biting into his cheek. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him, stripping away the arrogant delusion that he could fix this. He was dying. His pack was dying, and the only person who could save him was securely locked behind impenetrable walls, guarded by monsters who would gladly tear him limb from limb. Please, Ronald rasped, the word tasting like bile. The great Alpha King of Valdris, the man who had proudly declared Seren's bloodline tainted, was now crying, his tears freezing instantly on his ruined face. Please, just let me see her. If she touches me, if she just accepts the bond, the sickness will stop. I will give her the crown. I will grovel at her feet. I will surrender my northern borders. Just open the gate. Gareth turned away, preparing to walk back into the warmth of the fortress. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder, his eyes flat and merciless. She doesn't want your crown, Thorn, Gareth said, delivering the final fatal blow to Ronald's sanity. She is already wearing ours. Not used, not owned, chosen. Our king has claimed her as his equal. If you take one step onto this territory, Caelan Cross will not grant you a quick death. He will mount your head on a pike so your former mate can watch the snow bury it. The Beta disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ronald kneeling in the snow alone. The heavy thud of the inner courtyard doors, slamming shut, echoed like a death knell. Ronald pressed his forehead against the freezing iron bars, his fingers clawing desperately at the snow. The scent of moonflowers and winter mint lingered in the air, a cruel, beautiful reminder of the salvation that was sitting just a few hundred yards away, warm, safe, and completely untouchable. He had watched her leave like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. And for the first time, the king knew true terror. He had rejected her at the altar, and now the universe was forcing him to choke on his own broken vows. He closed his eyes, the dark blood dripping from his chin onto the pristine white snow, and finally, pathetically, began to sob. The snow did not care that he was a king. It fell in thick, freezing sheets, burying Ronald Thorn where he knelt outside the massive iron gates of Ashenir. The physical agony of the bond sickness was unlike anything he had ever endured. It wasn't just a hollow ache. It was a violent, tearing sensation in his chest, as if a spectral hand were reaching through his ribs to crush his heart. The rejection scars, those blackened, jagged lines that had seared themselves into his flesh the moment the claiming ritual backfired at the Moonstone Temple, throbbed with necrotic heat. Every gasp of the freezing northern air felt like inhaling powdered glass. Above him, standing on the high stone ramparts of the northern Lycan sanctuary, Gareth Hale looked down with absolute, freezing disdain. The Lycan Beta Guard didn't bother to draw a weapon. He didn't need to. Ronald was already a dead man walking. A king without a crown is just a man. Gareth's voice carried over the howling wind, laced with disgust. But an alpha who severs his own fated bond is already a ghost. Go back to your dying lands, Thorn. There is nothing for you here. Ronald squeezed his eyes shut, his bloody fingers scraping hopelessly against the impenetrable iron. Gareth was right. Through the shattered, dying remnants of his pack-link, Ronald could feel Valdris withering. The magic was draining from the soil. The moon goddess's punishment for his heresy was absolute, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome, but the goddess demanded a price for a stolen vow. He had traded his true mate for a political illusion, and now he was paying with his life. But madness and desperation drove the dying Alpha forward. With a final, guttural roar that tore his throat, Ronald channeled the very last dregs of his withering pack magic into his freezing hands. The massive iron gates groaned under the dark pressure and finally gave way to his suicidal force. Inside the fortress, separated from the blizzard by walls of ancient black stone, the temperature shifted completely. The throne room of Ashenir was carved from winter itself, yet Seren felt no cold. A massive hearth crackled with a roaring fire, casting long, dancing shadows across the tapestries. She stood by the towering arched window, looking out into the white abyss. She did not look down at the courtyard. She didn't need to. The faint, sickening pull of Ronald's presence was fading from her blood, replaced by a profound, echoing quiet. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight out of sheer habit, bracing for a blow that was no longer coming. "You don't need to do that here." The voice was a low rumble of thunder, vibrating through the stone floor and straight into her bones. Seren turned slowly. Cailan Cross stood at the edge of the firelight. The rival Lycan King was a terrifying vision of primal power, broad-shouldered, scarred from centuries of war, and radiating a lethal protective aura that made the air heavy. Yet, when his storm-glass grey eyes met hers, the raw dominance in his gaze immediately softened into something entirely different. Reverence. Seren didn't know the Alpha King could see through glamours. She didn't know he had been searching for her specific bloodline for his entire reign. And she definitely didn't know that the very quietness Ronald had despised was the exact trait Cailan worshipped. "He breached your gates," Seren stated. Her voice was flat, devoid of tears, completely drained of the hysteria Ronald had always expected from her. "He is dying because he ripped his own soul in half," Cailan corrected, taking a slow, measured step closer. He stopped 3 feet away, giving her space, always giving her space. "The magic of the bond cannot be forced. He tried to substitute you for your sister. The universe is simply balancing the scales." Cailan's jaw tightened, a dangerous growl vibrating in his chest. "If he steps foot in this room, I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow him to touch you." Seren looked down at her wrists. The phantom burn of the golden mating thread she had severed with the ceremonial silver blade still tingled. "I have nothing to offer you, Cailan. I am a wolfless Omega, a discarded bride." Cailan moved then. He didn't just step forward. He dropped completely to his knees on the hard stone floor. The undisputed sovereign of the North, a man who bowed to no god and no empire, kneeling at the feet of a runaway. "You are the Unbinder," Cailan rasped, his voice thick with raw emotion. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands hovering just an inch from hers, waiting for her silent permission before gently cupping her frozen fingers. The moment his skin met hers, a jolt of pure, terrifying electricity shot up her arm. "You possess the oldest magic in our history. But even if you were completely ordinary, even if you were broken beyond repair, you would still be my choice. I do not want to own you, Seren. I want to stand beside you." A tear, the very first one she had allowed herself to shed since the humiliation at the altar, finally slipped down her cheek. Some wounds could only be healed with love. She nodded. A single, infinitesimally small movement. Before Cailan could rise, a deafening crash shook the very foundations of the ancient keep. The heavy oak doors of the throne room exploded inward, splintering like kindling against the cold stone walls. Ronald Thorne stumbled into the firelight. He looked like a corpse, dragged from a frozen river. His royal garments were shredded, his face gaunt and pale, and the blackened rejection scars pulsed visibly against his throat, weeping dark blood. He had breached the sanctuary on the last ragged fumes of his madness. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as his deranged, bloodshot eyes locked onto the woman he had discarded. Seren, Ronald choked out, spitting blood onto the pristine marble. The sight of the rival Lycan king, kneeling before his rejected mate, snapped the last thread of his sanity. "Get away from him. You are mine. Come back to Valdris right now." Kaelin's eyes flashed from storm grey to molten gold. He didn't rush. He simply stood, towering over the broken false king, and unleashed his full, crushing aura. The air in the throne room instantly grew heavy, thick with the terrifying pressure of an apex predator. Ronald didn't stand a chance. The sheer weight of Kaelin's dominance slammed into him like a physical blow, driving him violently to his knees on the hard stone floor. His bones cracked under the pressure. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. All he could do was kneel there, completely paralyzed, gasping in agony as Kaelin turned his attention back to Seren. Kaelin brushed her silver hair over her shoulder, his lips grazing the sensitive skin of her pulse point. He didn't look at Ronald. He didn't need to. His focus was entirely on his true mate. When his fangs lengthened and pierced her flesh, there was no pain. Instead, the world exploded in light. The claiming bite didn't forge a chain. It unlocked a vault. A blinding rush of liquid silver magic erupted from Seren's chest, shattering the decades-old seal on her unbinder lineage. The sheer force of the true bond snapping into place sent a magical shockwave pulsing outward, sweeping over the northern mountains as a beacon of pure, undeniable sovereignty. For Ronald, kneeling paralyzed on the floor, the sight of Kaelin's fangs sinking into Seren's neck was a fatal physical agony. The silver unbinder magic violently severed the very last, lingering strings of his pack link. He felt his connection to Valdris snap completely. His pack magic dissolved into ash. He was forced to witness the rival Lycan king permanently claim the bride he had foolishly thrown away. A wet, broken rattle escaped Ronald's throat as the bond sickness claimed him completely. He collapsed face first onto the cold stone floor of the throne room. Darkness took the false king. Hundreds of miles away, within the opulent, suffocating walls of the Valdris infirmary, there was no peace. Lillian Vantrell writhed on the silk sheets, her high-pitched screams echoing through the stone corridors. The rejection scars that spider-webbed up her neck were no longer just burns. They were necrotizing. The dark magic of the broken ritual was consuming the very flesh she had used to seduce a king. Her beauty, her ultimate weapon, was rotting away. Orion stood at the foot of her bed. The high priest's face was carved from granite, completely devoid of mercy. He held the sacred texts in his hands, staring down at the writhing woman who had dared to mock the moon goddess. "Do something," Lillian shrieked, her voice a wet, gurgling rasp as a new blister burst on her collarbone. "I am your queen. You are nothing," Orion declared, his voice booming with absolute authority. "You accepted a stolen vow. You stood at the altar and wore the silver veil that belonged to your sister. The goddess does not heal those who poison the sacred well." The high priest turned his back on her, the heavy embroidered hem of his robe sweeping the floor. "There is no cure for divine retribution. The Vantrell name is stripped from you. You will live out the rest of your short, agonizing days in the darkness you created." He walked out, the heavy iron door slamming shut, plunging Lillian into eternal, agonizing isolation. The court of Valdris was already falling, its false royals crushed under the weight of their own arrogance. Months later, the harsh northern winter gave way to the vibrant, blooming warmth of spring in Ashenir. The nesting room was a sanctuary of sunlight, draped in heavy furs and the intoxicating scents of cedar, rain, and blooming moonflowers. Seren sat in the center of the massive bed, tracing the glowing silver mark on her neck. It didn't burn. It thrummed with a steady, comforting heartbeat. She watched Kaelin as he stoked the fire across the room. The Lycan king paused, feeling her gaze, and turned. The absolute devotion in his molten gold eyes stole the breath from her lungs every single time. He crossed the room, climbing onto the mattress to wrap his massive arms around her from behind, burying his face in the crook of her neck where his mark rested. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She had stood in silence as her world was dismantled. She would never step aside again. The ancient magic humming in her veins was proof that the moon goddess never abandons the faithful, the Omega who accepted rejection. The king who learned to love, and the bond that proved stronger than any curse. Not used, not owned, chosen. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments below. Did Ronald suffer enough for his betrayal? Or did the true punishment come from losing his magic? Your thoughts mean more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Alpha Law Audio Architect. Where are you listening from tonight? Let's meet in the comments.